Okay, well, I think we'll begin. So, hello everyone. My name's Tony Lasasso. I want to thank you for joining us here today for this hugely significant issue that we're going to be talking about. We're really happy to be doing this. I'm here on behalf of ASHEcon, but we're working in partnership with APPAM on this our second webinar. Hopefully, second of many more to come on policy topics that intersect both the health economics realm and the public policy world. So today we are delighted to have an exceptional group of scholars here to talk about this very significant issue. I'll be handing it over here momentarily to Stacy Duzitsina, who will be our moderator for this 1-hour webinar. She is the Ingram Associate Professor of Cancer Research at Vanderbilt University. We'll also be joined by Aditi Sen, who is an Assistant Professor at Johns Hopkins, and Andrew Mulcahy, who's the Associate Director of Economic Sociology and Statistics at RAND, and Rena Conti, who's an Associate Professor of Markets, Public Policy, and Law at Boston University. So again, thank you for being on and joining us. Stacy, I'm going to have you take it away.
Great, thanks very much. Let's jump ahead a couple of slides, if you don't mind. One more. All right, so welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for this really important and exciting webinar. I have the opportunity today to be the moderator for this call, and I'm really excited to do that. So I was given the small task of giving an overview of what's going on in drug spending in the United States, including thinking about some of the challenges that we're facing in this country regarding both pricing and access, and what we can all think about doing about that. I will be doing a quick crash course through this, and then we'll be passing it off to some of the other speakers who hopefully will be providing us with some suggestions and solutions. Next slide, please. Okay, so as many of you know, spending on prescription drugs has been increasing over time, as much as other areas of healthcare spending. One of the things that we do know, however, with prescription drug spending is that we're seeing some large increases in certain areas of spending, in particular on specialty drugs. We know that there have been pretty significant increases as both the number of products in that category and also the price points for those products has increased. Now, we also know that not only are retail drug spending trends suggesting that we're spending more money, but physician-administered drugs have also been increasing in price over time, with about roughly 9 to 10% per year growth in those products from 2010 to 2016. And as many of you likely know, there's always this debate about what price is going up. And so we know that there are increases in both the list price of drugs and also some increases in the net price of drugs after rebates and discounts have been accounted for, although it's a little bit mixed regarding those trends. So next slide, please. When we look at national health expenditures on prescription drugs, and this is for retail drug spending, you can see why we're concerned. As of 2015, it's estimated that we spend over $334 billion on retail drugs, and it's expected that that will increase quite dramatically over the coming years, and that by 2027, we'll be spending over $600 billion on these products. Now, when we think about spending in Medicare, for example, drugs offered in the outpatient setting, the retail setting, represent about 15% of all of Medicare spending. Drugs on Medicare Part B or physician-administered drugs represent about 4% of spending. Next slide. So why are we in this situation? What are the drivers of price? We know that lack of competition is a key driver of pricing today. We recognize the importance of generic entry for driving down prices, but we really do recognize that many of the drugs where we're spending large amounts of money and seeing price increases are those areas where we have branded manufacturers, only one treatment option, and very limited ability to negotiate. We also recognize that this is occurring in a large way in the specialty drug space that again is taking over a larger part of our spending, where we have small patient populations. This includes orphan drugs and other disease areas where the number of potentially eligible patients is small, and so the prices that are being set at launch of the products are increasing. We also know that we have a lack of ability to negotiate in some settings. The protected classes under Medicare Part D are a good example, where we are required to cover all products in those categories. And so we know that even within our current system, that rebates and discounts for products that are required to be covered can be much smaller because we lack effective ability to negotiate there. And then there is some lack of accountability for some of the key stakeholders. We recognize that there is, that all of the stakeholders in the supply chain are interested in maximizing their profits. And so we've seen some particularly bad behavior by some of those actors over recent years. And those issues also extend to trying to delay competition, for example. Okay, next slide. So what is the challenge with this when we think about why this has become, a key issue for members of Congress and also for patients and their families, is that we also have this collision of prices meeting benefit design. And we know that in the United States, we're seeing a growing number of people that are exposed to both deductibles and percentage-based cost sharing through coinsurance. So we see, for example, among employer-sponsored plans that about nearly half in 2015 have a deductible that is at least $1,000. So more patients are being exposed to the drug's price. Next slide. And I think that probably the most concerning here is that we know that when prices go up to patients at the pharmacy counter, that they're more likely to be skipping their medications or doses of their medications. And this was a nice summary of how often this was expected to occur. And you can see the bars to the far right side of the graph represent what happens in the US for people who have insurance and those who are uninsured. Certainly, access to prescription drugs for people without health insurance today is quite limited. And we know from other recent studies that up to 1 in 4 patients, for example, really are reporting that they're struggling to take their drugs as prescribed. So it's an important reason to be concerned about this area. Next slide. But as all of you probably know, this is complicated, and so a lot of policy solutions aim to address one part of the system, but don't really think about the multiple parts that are at play here and the entities that are involved in the drug supply and distribution chain. And so exercising options to address one part of this, like out-of-pocket spending, for example, could have negative impacts on spending by taxpayers and spending by governments overall. So solutions are likely to be fairly complicated as this is a complex issue. And next slide. So to cap it off and get ready to hear from your next set of presenters, I just want to kind of say that I think we all recognize the importance of prescription drugs to society. We also recognize that they are a high-risk business. They're expensive to develop in many cases, but they are becoming unaffordable for many patients. And a lot of the policies that we have in place today were constructed around a system of drugs that were just fundamentally priced lower and used by large patient populations. So as we've gotten better at treating certain diseases, those prices have gone up and our policies haven't kept pace. So we need to really figure out how to get more of what we want, get more innovation, and paying for that innovation while also making sure that the drugs are accessible to everyone. So with that, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Aditi Sen, who is going to be one of our first speakers. And she is going to hopefully help us start to think about what has happened, what the government has done so far to address some of drug pricing and its impact on healthcare policy. Aditi?
Great, thank you, Stacy. So you can go forward in the slides, please, and maybe even just to the next one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been going on at both the state and federal level. And obviously there is a lot to talk about, so I'm going to touch on a few aspects of federal policy, but really spend most of my time talking about some what I think are quite interesting and innovative approaches going on at the state level. Obviously, state and federal governments have been really focused on this issue. They're focused on managing drug costs through a variety of approaches. There are certain remedies for high drug prices that really can come only from the federal government. For example, only the federal government can authorize Medicare to negotiate drug prices or change formularies for Part D, or reduce patent terms, so shorten the time during which drug companies can exclude competitors and enjoy monopoly pricing power. So there are a lot of things that only the federal government can do. There hasn't been a lot of congressional action in the past couple of years, but things are starting to really change now since the November elections, and there are already a number of bills related to drug pricing that have been introduced. The administration has released several plans and proposals in this area. A lot of them remain in quite the early stages with still relatively few details on how they will be implemented. So this is really an area that I think will be interesting to watch going forward. Some of the big proposals that have come from the administration are listed here. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to talk in depth about any of them. I could probably spend 10 minutes talking about each of these. So I'm going to just sort of do a quick run through and then we'll go on and talk about states. But just to give you kind of a sense of what's being talked about. So recently, the administration released a proposed rule which aims to eliminate rebates from pharmaceutical companies to pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs, in Medicare Part D and Medicaid managed care. And I think it's kind of widely agreed that in its current form, if this were to go forward, this would be a big change to the prescription drug pricing system. It's been hard to forecast its effect, and it's unclear exactly how the implementation will go forward. But the bottom line is that the current incentive system, as Stacy mentioned, encourages these kind of high list prices. And since cost sharing is typically calculated based on list prices rather than the lower net price, patients are exposed to these sort of high prices. And if rebates are driving them up, then we have reason to be really concerned about that. So the proposed rule would eliminate the existing regulatory safe harbor, meaning that PBMs that get such rebates would now be subject to anti-kickback statute scrutiny. And so this would be a really big change to the drug pricing system, and will be interesting to see how that goes forward. There have also been a number of Part D reforms that have been talked about, including changing requirements around coverage or protected classes, point of sale price concessions. Again, the details of these specific proposals vary. The administration has talked about shifting Medicare Part B drugs into Part D. So a lot of sort of different ideas that have been have been floated are in various stages of development. I think another big change that is being discussed is external reference pricing in Part B. And so this would try to align Part B reimbursements with international prices so that the amount that Medicare reimburses would be tied to an international reference price pricing index. And so this would also be a big change. And again, sort of details and implementation haven't been, there are not very many details yet. We've also heard about inclusion of list prices in television ads. Biosimilars policy is likely to be a growing issue. The FDA advanced an action plan that is intended to encourage innovation and competition among biologics and the development of biosimilars. They're also developing sort of new tools and resources for sponsors of biosimilar applications. So I think that's going to be another interesting area to watch. And then just recently, we've seen some moves from Congress, from the House Ways and Means Committee, to look at patient assistance programs, which offer low cost or free drugs to certain individuals, usually with insurance. They can have Part D, who can't afford their medications. And pharmaceutical companies tend to be among the biggest donors to these kind of programs, and so they get big tax write-offs through these donations. And so the House Ways and Means Committee is interested in examining the tax advantages that drug companies get through these programs. So I think there's a lot of sort of different kind of angles that the federal government is looking to potentially address these challenges that Stacey talked about with the high and rising prices of drug costs. So it's going to be really interesting to keep our eye on this space going forward. So you can go ahead a slide. So now for states. So states have a significant amount of authority to take a range of actions to regulate drug prices. I think states are really interesting as sort of labs for federal policy and also for kind of informing other state efforts. And so what this map from the National Conference of State Legislatures is showing is state level legislation related to pharmaceutical costs, pricing, and payment over the 2015 through 17 period. And you can see that there's quite a lot going on. So states in the lightest green have 1 to 2 enacted bills. States with a slightly darker shade of green, including North Dakota and New York, some of the New England states, have enacted 3 to 4 bills, and those in dark green have 5 or more enacted bills. So there's clearly increased interest. There's over 100 different signed bills from nearly all, I think 45 of the 50 states. And 2017 in particular saw sort of a rise of state policymaking in prescription drugs, and particularly on pricing. And so some of these efforts seek to reduce overall costs or prices of drugs, while others may sort of shift costs from patients or payers to other entities. And so we'll talk about some specific approaches in a minute, but these have included fair pricing bills, which seek to constrain rising prices directly, transparency bills, and also in the Medicaid space, some sort of reforms in that area. So you can go ahead, another slide. So before getting into some examples, this just brings us up to date. This includes, this map shows laws on prescription drugs enacted in 2018. And again, you can see that states with the lightest purple have enacted 1 to 4 laws just in 2018, and states with the darker purple had 5 or more. So there's a lot going on at the state level. You can go forward. Thanks. So I want to highlight a couple of specific areas of state action and then talk briefly about some other approaches. So the first area is legislation related to anti-price gouging efforts for generic drugs. And that's what this map shows. This map shows that several states, those in yellow, had some sort of bill related to anti-price gouging that didn't pass between 2016 and 2018. And those in purple, including Illinois and New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, filed bills on this topic in 2017 or 18. And Maryland, which is the one in green, is the only state to actually pass legislation that's focused on anti-price gouging. So in Maryland, the law authorizes the Attorney General to prosecute firms that engage in price increases in non-competitive off-patent drug markets that are dramatic enough to quote unquote shock the conscience of any reasonable consumer. So the bill was passed, it was challenged in the courts and is going to be appealed to the Supreme Court. So it'll be, I think, really kind of set the stage for other states depending on how that goes. Maryland has also taken up the issue of high-priced branded drugs. And so last year, the legislature debated the idea of a statewide upper payment limit for certain high-cost drugs and is taking up the idea again this year. Okay, go ahead. Another approach that more states have taken to kind of immediately lower out-of-pocket costs to consumers is prohibiting PBM gag clauses. So these are laws that typically block commercial PBM or health insurer contracts from prohibiting, that may prohibit pharmacies from informing customers about available alternative pricing for medications, including paying out of pocket or including generics or brand products that may be less costly. So essentially, this is when a patient goes in to pick up their prescription at the pharmacy and may unknowingly pay more for that prescription using their insurance than they would have, say, if they had just paid out of pocket. And so these laws prohibiting these gag clauses would require pharmacists to tell patients that this was the case if they could save money from paying an alternative way. And so you can see that there has been relatively more action in this area. There were enacted laws in at least 29 states between 2004 and 2018, and filed laws in several more states. And also, as an example of state law sort of laying the groundwork for federal policy, the Congress passed a law last year that aims to end these practices that prohibit pharmacists from telling customers that they could save money by paying cash out of pocket rather than using their insurance. And so that law has been approved by Congress, banning these gag clauses both in private insurance and in Medicare. Okay, you can go ahead. Okay, so there are a number of other approaches that states are taking. So in Vermont, they have passed the first in the nation law that would facilitate the state's importation of high-cost prescription drugs wholesale from Canada. Their law provides that the state will submit a request to HHS for this importation program by July of this year, and we'll see how HHS responds. Secretary Azar has spoken against this in the past, so it'll be interesting to see what happens with this sort of first mover in this space. There are multiple states that have taken action in the area of cost and price transparency. These laws typically require manufacturers to disclose additional cost and price information for expensive medicines with unexplained high prices or price increases, and sometimes require justification for the increase. The laws vary a little bit across states, but in general, they require this kind of disclosure for drugs for which costs have increased by a certain amount. Some focus on the drugs with the highest cost and largest increases. Nevada's law focuses on diabetes drugs. Louisiana's requires that any manufacturer or pharmaceutical marketer who engages in any kind of marketing to a physician or prescriber has to provide the current wholesale acquisition cost of each of the drugs that were marketed. So the laws vary across the states, but they're all the sort of area of transparency. California has a law regulating drug discount coupons, which prohibits any company or person who manufactures a prescription drug from offering any discount coupons or product vouchers or reductions in individual out-of-pocket expenses. So it'll be interesting to see kind of if that is replicated across other states. And then there have been a few different efforts to address high prices in Medicaid through purchasing and coverage policy. So Louisiana is pioneering what they're calling the Netflix model, through which they will purchase annual and unlimited quantities of hepatitis C treatment at a set price And so, that could also lay the groundwork for other states. And New York has established a Medicaid drug cap as sort of a separate component within the Medicaid global cap, which directs the state Department of Health to require manufacturer rebates for drugs which would otherwise exceed a projected spending target. So there are a lot of different advancements that are being made at the state level. They are not without challenge. As I mentioned, the Maryland law has been challenged. This New York law has been challenged. So it'll be interesting, I think, going forward to see how these challenges play out. It'll be a sign of how authority will be sort of divided between states and the federal government. In many cases, the federal government will need to either change laws or allow states flexibility to implement changes as they see necessary. And I think we can also expect to see more congressional actions while states sort of also stay at the forefront of innovation in this area. So thanks, and I'll pass it along to Rena.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for hosting this event. Fantastic conversation to have. I'm actually going to switch on my webcam, if you will, so you don't have to look at a horrible picture of me to me in person. So I want to back up a little and talk a little bit about how we should think about this as health economists and also as folks who are experts who can engage with policymakers in a variety of different ways based on the way in which we think about these things, but also the way in which we can build evidence bases to address them. So the first is that that you should be aware of is that obviously there is a difference between spending, which is some conjunction of prices plus use, and price. And it's not clear to me in the data that we have, or I guess I would say more generally, there is slippage in the way in which we talk about this, and certainly policymakers talk about what exactly is the problem. Is it price or is it spend? And I guess I would argue that it depends on which problem that we're talking about. So secondly, let's think a little bit harder about the market forces and specifically the market failures that we are seeing in this specific market. And again, my argument here is that it's not much different than other aspects of healthcare that have been well documented in the past. And if anything, many of the members of this panel and others who are working on these topics are really filling in the knowledge gap, creating a record of exactly how the market failures work in this specific market in healthcare and what may be their similarities and differences. So from my perspective, there are three important market failures that are operating in this market. The first is asymmetric information, and the derived market failures associated with insurance with that asymmetric information, which leads to both moral hazard, overuse, but also underuse and even misuse of the available products that we have. We also have issues related to adverse selection and the use of prescription drugs to drive certain types of selection into insurance markets versus others. There are some policy levers that have been used to try to reduce that, but I would argue this is an active area of interest among health economists and one that we could learn a lot more about. Second is related to barriers to entry and the associated rent seeking among multiple members of the supply chain for these drugs. Clearly, we have some issues related to monopoly and duopoly activities, both in the branded market, but also in the generic market. That again, we have some empirical base for, but I think again, we could have a lot more that I think would be quite helpful. But also, we have a significant amount of rent seeking, which actually feeds, among other middlemen in the process, which includes PBMs, but also pharmacies, physicians, and hospitals. In some sense, many people are making money off the high price of drugs. Some of this is related to the rebate discussion that is occurring at the federal level, but there are other issues that this is related to as well, which includes reform of Part B in Medicare, but other issues as well. And then finally, there is clearly a fundamental mismatch between the incentives that we have for new products coming onto the market. This can lead both to the underinvestment in certain things that can truly improve people's health, but also reduce spending, possibly. But also potentially the underinvestment or the overinvestment in the availability of new technologies that feed back into these barriers to entry and rent seeking on this industry more generally. Again, and I would say here, we don't actually know that much about these incentives, and I'll in my last bit of comments, I'll tell you a little bit more about how I think about that. So the other thing I think you should all be aware of is that what the right level of spending is on these drugs relative to other inputs for healthcare really depends on how productive and where we are in the production frontier on these products relative to other aspects or other inputs in medical care. And it likely depends on the disease state and also the existing technology that we have. And what are the outside potential options for treating or diagnosing certain diseases? There's this issue shares a lot of similarities actually with what the right level of innovation is, and to what extent price or other rewards should be used to reward certain types of innovation and retard others. So what can the health economics and health services research community contribute empirically? I think first, on the first market failure, we actually know a lot about how insurance is or is not working to help defray the cost of these products at the time of service, and how that may actually either help or hurt patients getting access to these therapies. And there, I would say, having health economists and other experts involved in ongoing experiments, which Didi has mentioned very nicely, but there are others that could be implemented, and then really thinking through how to implement them and how to assess their outcomes is very important. I'm very involved in the Louisiana subscription model for hepatitis C. We don't like to call it Netflix because it isn't really a Netflix type model. But here, basically, what the state is doing is pursuing a quantity guarantee in exchange for lower prices that have rights and responsibilities on all sides to really go out and find people who are infected with these illnesses and treat them. This looks very similar to what we do with vaccines, what we do in purchasing of HIV drugs and other conditions and other types of treatments, both nationally but also internationally, and thinking through how to evaluate these things, what are the right outcomes, but also to what extent this type of experiment, among many others that could be implemented to address insurance failures, I think is a key role for people like us to play. Secondly, there is some, but less than we, I think, desire, empirical evidence base and theoretical evidence base about monopoly, power, and rent seeking in this market. Some of this has to do with the fact that empirical data is much more difficult to come by, in part because the incentives governing the actors in these markets, whether they be physicians or hospitals or PBMs or pharmacies or pharmaceutical companies, are really proprietary and they're contractual. So the kind of usual, we go to claims data and we try to figure out whether these incentives exist and how they're operating in this market doesn't really apply. And here I think there's a great opportunity for theoreticians in economics to think about possibilities for how we think the behaviors are operating, and then go out and match that to the empirical data that we do have. And I think that would also help us identify potential policy experiments that can be implemented both at the state and the federal level to reduce certain types of monopoly power or barriers to entry or rent seeking, and also try to bound how much we would actually get out in terms of lower prices and or lower spend or lower wasteful spend, if you will, on potential policy options. And then finally, in this last issue of market failures related to investments for innovation, we know a little bit empirically about the relationship between prices and really revenue, not prices. So again, that conjunction of price and utilization on incentives for innovation. We actually know much less about both theoretically and also empirically about the other types of incentives that exist for innovators to be in this space and to invest funds. And we also don't really know that much about alternate ways of financing or rewarding innovators that are rewarding innovations for their investments that are not based on taxing prices per unit spend, but actually taxing either revenue or gross revenue in this market. So I think that's a really exciting area for more empirical work, but also more theoretical work as well. I think I'll stop there.
Great. Hi, this is Andrew Mulcahy. Could you go to the next slide, please? Just want to say thanks to ASHEcon and APPAM for organizing the webinar, and to all of you for attending. So Tony asked me to talk a bit about what health economists can do to influence prescription drug policy and policy around drug prices a little more narrowly. So at the risk of oversimplifying things, I started out by boiling this down to the same 3 steps that I think about when looking to have an impact through my research in any policy area. So first, understanding the landscape, then doing high quality research, and finally communicating results. So I'll walk through each of these points in a single slide each with a focus on application to prescription drug policy. So the first step is to understand the policy landscape. This is really a necessary foundation before you can reasonably hope to influence policy. Now, one way to think about this is a kind of barrier to entry into this area. We have to invest up front to get fluent in a policy area before you can do research and communicate results with authority. So, as all of the other speakers have either said directly or hinted at, the barrier to entry around prescription drug policy is really quite high. This is a truly complex policy landscape, even in comparison to other corners of our U.S. healthcare system, where complexity is the norm. This is our own little corner that we have to kind of figure out. So maybe many of you on the call here today are already quite fluent with this policy landscape around drugs. For others, I just want to quickly highlight a few avenues for getting up to speed quickly that I've used in the past. So, the first place I always go is to read up on policy proposals. Didi summarized quite nicely a broad range of policies, either in the works in states or at the federal level. That's a great place to start. There's also very often, statements, reports, policy positions from industry and other stakeholder groups that can be very helpful to get up to speed quickly. moving beyond reading and then starting to talk with folks in federal and state government from different stakeholder groups like drug manufacturers, PBMs, insurers. That's a very helpful next step, and there are great opportunities to do that at some of the events hosted by APPAM and ASHEcon and other groups, and then at policy events in DC and elsewhere. And when doing this kind of background work, I think it is really helpful to dip into our economics framework and toolkit to try to tease out what incentives are at work here that motivate particular positions. This current debate on whether the blame for high drug prices should rest more on manufacturers or PBMs is a great example. If you kind of think through it, some of the positions and why you're seeing, I get a lot of, maybe it's because the Googling I do, I'm not sure. I get a lot of ads when I'm just browsing the internet from certain industry groups on either side. And thinking through the incentives help you understand the positions that you hear about in the media sometimes, or from these groups directly. So congrats to everyone on the line for checking this next bullet off. I think the previous speakers covered a lot of policy landscape territory. Webinars, events like this are a great way to stay up to date. And kind of close out this slide, and I don't intend for this to come across as a complaint or a burden that we have to bear, but it really does take a sustained investment to stay current in any policy area, particularly one developing as rapidly as policy around prescription drugs and drug prices right now. Next slide, please. So the next step is to do high quality research related to policy. And I won't spend a lot of time on this step. Rena just highlighted some specific areas where, we as a profession can think about heading next. I'll highlight a couple of points that, many folks on this call probably already know. First, that, doing that high quality policy related research is easier said than done. The data can be hard to get and hard to use. And that it's sometimes the case that the most relevant research to policymakers doesn't neatly fit the mold of our traditional academic style research. Sometimes it does, but not always. I guess one thing I'd say as a kind of silver lining here is that the current attention on drug prices and other issues around prescription drug policy, and the fact that that this as a policy issue affects all of us, most businesses and industries, the government at multiple levels, means that there's a lot of attention here. There's a lot of funding, a lot of folks interested in figuring this out. So for those of us who need to think about looking for support for research, that is a bit of a silver lining. So next slide. And the third step here is to communicate results. And Stacy and some of the other speakers hinted at the main challenge here, that prescription drugs, drug prices, the markets, the policies are really complicated. As I mentioned, probably equally, if not more so than some other corners of our U.S. healthcare system, and that's really saying something. And all of us in this working in this area face this balancing act of trying to package our work into sound bites and headlines and tweets while still being both objective and accurate. And frankly, that's hard to do. I could talk through a lot of examples here. I could talk about the really different pricing or other trends across different types of drugs, brand versus generic, specialty versus not, et cetera, different distribution channels. I could talk about payment policy. I guess I'd focus on one example that might be most relevant to the webinar today, and that's just the difficulty in communicating as simple a thing as what we mean by the price of a drug. We use that word price all the time, naturally, when talking about drug prices. But the lack of specificity in terms of what we mean when we use that term can really muddle the punchline of a result from a study or the relevance of a policy to a particular setting. So prices as drugs leave factories, that's one thing. Retail prices are another thing. Out-of-pocket prices are another thing. Prices paid by PBMs and insurers net of rebates are yet another thing. Or all of these different flavors of prices. You read a headline, it just says price. You usually need to work pretty hard to figure it out. what actually is being used, the price that might be most relevant from a policy point of view, which is this price net of rebates, they're famously hard to get a hold of. Some analytic shops are using estimates of rebates to try to work them into estimates of spending that you can then use to kind of back out a price, but that's still a lot of uncertainty there. So given all of this complexity and the challenges in communicating what we actually mean when saying something like just the simple phrase drug price, I always try to be very specific, and to sometimes that takes a few extra minutes of conversation with a policymaker or a reporter or whoever it is you're talking to really get the point across. But there are very important distinctions here. In terms of the use of this word price, the most obvious place is when you're thinking through whether or not high retail prices are a real problem. And I understand that there are links between those prices and out-of-pocket amounts. But it kind of big picture, you'd probably want to layer on what happens net of rebates in many cases, and that's tough to do. So whether or not some of these drug price issues that we hear about in the media and talk about a lot today affect everyone very broadly, affect everyone to some extent, but much more so those without coverage paying cash, those are all very important distinctions. And communicating the details of the work and how we're using some of these terms and how they relate to different segments of the population, I think is very important. So next slide. I'll just quickly highlight 3 avenues that allow health economists to have an impact on policy. So the first is traditional academic style publication. It's clear that research that lands in top tier journals makes it into the hands of policymakers, and you can have impact through that channel. It does leave a lot up to chance just to publish and hope for the best. So it usually on top of that, proactive outreach from all of us is very helpful. Another avenue to impact is to do research directly for or with state and federal governments or other decision makers. And we do this very often at RAND. Some folks at universities do this routinely. It's a great opportunity to do research that has a built-in kind of link to policy, because it's the ask to do the research, the need to do the research, the motivation for answering the research question comes from folks in a decision to help push policy forward. And the final thing I'd say, and this one's more of a recommendation, is to consider some shorter, punchier pieces, either instead of or in conjunction with more traditional papers or reports. I was just looking at some of my download counts for the reports that I led at rand.org, and I'd estimate for some of my longer book-style technical reports, probably 5 people outside of my immediate family have downloaded some of these reports. They don't get a lot of traffic. But this short piece I put here, it's a brief 15-page kind of primer on biosimilars with an estimate of cost savings from biosimilars. By comparison, this thing's a bestseller. Flies off the shelves. It's short, it's in color, it's far more likely to land in the hands of decision makers. And I've run into people over the past couple of years who have seen this and want to engage on it. So it's a bit of an extra lift, more work, investment up front. But I think taking this extra step to develop some of these shorter pieces, to engage in social media, think about these other ways to get our work out is very important. So that's all I have. Thanks for your time. I think we're turning to questions next, so I'll hand it over to Ryan or whoever else will moderate.
Thanks, Andrew. This is Stacy again. And so I'm going to just take a quick moment to just do a couple of key takeaways from each of the presenters' talks. And while I'm doing that, if you guys who are in the audience have questions, feel free to go ahead and submit those. I see we have a couple already queued up. So, thanks to all of the speakers. I think what we've heard from them are some nice complementary messages of thinking about how to deal with drug pricing. From Aditi, we heard about how states are taking a really active role and are really sort of the lab for health policy experiments trying to address prices and spending. And they're really a place where we can see some key innovation. Rena also, mentioning one of the key ways that economists can help be involved here and contribute is think about being involved in these experiments and being, the group to inform the design and evaluation of those experiments so we can all learn the lessons that we need so that we can extend very valuable policies, things that really work, that we can actually scale those up. And then Andrew very nicely summarized some of the key important things for all of us to think about is try to stay up to date in a very complicated and fast-moving area, do relevant research, and learn how to communicate it very clearly, which those are some big asks, but also, how you really are able to affect change in this area. So thank you again to all the speakers. For the next few minutes, we'll take a couple of questions. And so for the group, and I'm just going to let those of you speakers who want to try to grab this one, we have a question about whether you think that there are more incentives to develop drugs for managing diseases or symptoms rather than curing disease. And if you think that's the case, what do we do about that? How do we create incentives for curing diseases rather than just managing them?
This is Rena. I can start. So companies are in the business of maximizing revenue, and the opportunity to get incremental payments for units to manage chronic disease rather than cures. There are trade-offs there that firms are clearly acting on. One of the things that's actually quite notable is that we do actually have cures in many conditions now, and more are coming. And so there are incentives to develop cures. Part of that has to do with the state of science that exists, but part of that also has to do with the willingness of payers to actually pay high prices when those therapies do exist or coming on the market, or pay in other ways through reducing barriers to entry, reducing cost of production, or both the fixed cost of production, but also the variable cost of production, other types of guarantees in terms of market exclusivity that could also matter, or even changes in patent law.
Thank you. Great answer. All right. So another question we got that I'll throw out to the group is whether or not you're optimistic that state drug price transparency laws will yield useful or interesting data to help us understand the drug pricing dynamics. Anybody want to take that? Yeah, go ahead, Aditi.
I can start. So, I think it is, a good starting point. As we've heard in a lot of cases in healthcare, but in particular in the pharmaceutical space, just the question of what drives prices, what are the sort of prices at different levels of the supply chain. There's just a lot of uncertainty and a lack of clear information. And so, I think to the extent that transparency laws can give us some insight about how prices are changing and just sort of allow us to understand a little bit more, that'll be very helpful. I also think, there is some amount of role for transparency laws to play sort of a deterrent effect, where if manufacturers are required to have a justification for instance, unconscionable price increase, that might have a sort of deterrent effect. So there's sort of a range of impact that these kinds of laws could have, and I think they're an important, part of a portfolio of policy approaches to addressing high drug prices.
That's excellent. Yeah, thank you very much. So another question we got was actually around how the group thinks that the Affordable Care Act had impacted drug pricing behavior, and particularly as it relates to coverage of people with pre-existing conditions. I guess just kind of thinking broadly about the impacts of the Affordable Care Act, do you think it acted to exacerbate drug pricing issues, or do you think, maybe it didn't have a substantial effect? And I know that's very broad, so if anybody wants to take some piece of that.
So this is Rena. So I guess there are kind of at least two issues. The first is that the Affordable Care Act expanded access to prescription drug coverage for many people who did not otherwise have it. So again, it increased use. And again, it may have increased spending as well because of that. But again, we need to be careful of the slippage between to what extent these types of policies can impact spending versus increase price. Now, there are other aspects of the Affordable Care Act that are not related to the expansion that likely did have some impact on price. For one, the Affordable Care Act expanded access to 340B discounts for many qualified providers automatically. And that, we believe, may have had an impact on the pricing of existing drugs, which essentially tried to bake in those discounts that were now automatically applying and raise list prices. But likely also had some impact on what real people pay out of pocket for those drugs as well. There are several other aspects of the Affordable Care Act that have that type of flavor, where these kind of less transparent discounts increased and may have had some unintended impacts on list price and or the out-of-pocket costs that insured people pay.
Great, thanks, Rena. So I'm going to throw out this one question, which is quite broad, and I would like for all of the speakers to maybe weigh in on their one thing that they would like to add. The question is, what is the most important thing to know for U.S. prescription drug policy that we don't know very well right now? And so, if you were going to wave your magic wand and have all economists listening to this webinar know something, really deeply know it about prescription drug policy, what do you think would be the most helpful thing for them to know? We've stumped the speakers.
So that's a very deep question. I'm not sure if this is more of just what I think we would all benefit from in terms of data that would help us do more research. And getting into that vault or whatever it is in the basement of CMS where that data on rebates is kept, getting it through some other means, understanding what is really happening on the ground in terms of the margins that are attained by PBMs, the benefit they're adding to this this complex landscape, and the savings that insurers realize through rebates. I feel like that a spotlight on all of those details would really help us understand what's going on here in much more detail than we can piece together now.
I couldn't agree more.
Rena, So this is Rena. I outlined for you in my presentation some 3 places to look for good that we need more empirical work on. But I would re-emphasize kind of a larger point, which is what the right level of spending is on these drugs is again related to their marginal productivity relative to other things that people can do to improve their health. Mm-hmm. And I think we know something about the substitutability of drugs or other types of technology that is lower cost are lower labor costs relative to other things that we do in terms of physician time and hospital care, but we need to know a lot more about that. And same thing, and again, this comment around innovation is exactly analogous. We need to know a lot more about what is the right level of price in order to pull the types of innovations that will really, truly drive transformations in people's morbidity and also mortality.
Great.
And I guess one thing I'd also add to that is, a lot of these policy proposals that we've been talking about, for instance, the rebate proposal that is being discussed, depends a lot on things that economists know a lot about, which is, how will different firms in the supply chain react? How will consumers potentially react? And so I think that the policy space could benefit a lot from those of us who are doing work in this area and who are on the webinar thinking more about how can we bring what we know about firm and consumer behavior to this space to help us understand what the incentives are and how the market, such as it is, might respond to these different kinds of policies, and how can we use that to inform our policy decision making.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Aditi. I think that instead of just saying we're not sure how these firms will react, being able to model how they might react and have an informed estimate of what that may result in from a spending perspective or how the policy might play out would be very important for making rational decisions. So with that, thank you all for joining today. Really thank you to the speakers for really wonderful presentations. And I hope that you all gained a lot from their talks and joining the webinar. So thank you for joining. We will have the presentation posted on ASHEcon's website before too long, and you'll receive an email notification when the webinar is available online. Otherwise, thank you again, and thanks to all the speakers.